What's up, heathens? How ya doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically examine apologists' claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today is my first rebuttal to Spartan Theology in our ongoing YouTube debate. I appreciated his opening statement, but of course I have some issues with it. So if you want to find out what those issues are, then please stay tuned. Before we begin with my rebuttal, if you haven't seen Spartan Theology's opening statement, I highly suggest you go and watch it. I'm not going to splice in any of his opening statements here. This is supposed to be modeled after just a regular debate broken up into different videos over a course of weeks, and to remain consistent with that, I'm not going to splice his video in with this one. First, I appreciate that you weren't necessarily arguing for Christianity, but just theism in general. I feel like I provided somewhat of a general argument against theism and not so much specifically any one religion, although I did use Christianity as a primary example. So it seems like your arguments are basically the contingency argument and then the teleological argument, which you do admit the two are connected. Your second argument, the teleological argument, is highly dependent on the first argument, the contingency argument. I feel like this gives me a slight advantage because I really only have to argue against the contingency argument. I don't even have to technically mess with the teleological argument. You've defined God as the classical theist God, which means that he's independent of everything and he possesses the omni attributes. I think that attributing the omni attributes to your definition of God here makes it a little bit too specific for your argument, because then you're arguing for a specific subset of theism and not just theism in general. It's possible that God could exist and would be evil or just uncaring. Now, you go on to describe the basic contingency argument, which your particular version of the contingency argument doesn't differ all that much, but the contingency argument already suffers from very fallacious reasoning. For one thing, you have to make a leap in logic to specially plead for God in this argument. The fact is that we simply don't know what that necessary thing would be, and in my opinion, it's really just the underlying fabric of reality. This underlying fabric of reality would just simply be a natural state of the universe that also existed prior to the inflation of the universe. You see, I don't think that you can delineate between this God definition that you have and the underlying natural fabric of reality. So, like I said, your particular version of the contingency argument doesn't differ all that much from the basic one. You seem to presuppose that God is absolutely necessary in order for the natural world to stay consistent. Generally, in the contingency argument, apologists will specially plead for God's existence as not something that needs to be created as a way to explain how everything in the universe that begins to exist has a cause. So it kind of answers the question of, well, if everything in the universe had a cause, then does God have a cause? But like I said, this is just a special pleading argument for your ad hoc explanation of God. But in your particular argument, you seem to be specially pleading for God being necessary for nature in general. I feel like this results from an inability to conceive that the natural world just operates without the intervention of a conscious being. Of course, that doesn't mean that it's without cause, though. I agree that everything in this natural world does have a cause, but we have yet to establish a firm link between a supernatural conscious being and the natural laws of nature. But again, I challenge you to distinguish between the natural fabric of reality just governing these laws and your particular God needing to be there in order to make them consistent. Or you could just show me how you know that some conscious being is needed for the natural laws of the universe to remain consistent. You said the very idea of science being repeatable and testable is based on the fact that the laws of nature operate with extreme consistency. Now, I agree with you on this point, but I feel like it's an argument against your position, because the very idea of a supernatural being requires a suspension of this consistency that you speak of. You also claim that without a necessary foundation requiring the rest of reality to follow physical laws, there would be no reason for reality to follow laws at all. I'm wondering how you came to that conclusion, knowing that you consider this necessary foundation to be God. What is binding the natural laws of the universe to this God figure? I would call this necessary foundation just the nature of reality. I don't see a reason to ad hoc add some causal agent in order for this necessary foundation to regulate the laws of reality. What I need from you is to demonstrate why nature can't be self-regulating and that it needs some causal agent in order to keep it consistent. Also, the laws of nature are really just descriptions from our experiences with nature. These are not necessarily representative of the underlying nature of reality. For instance, we discovered that the laws of nature, as we experience them, break down the closer that we get to the event horizon of a black hole. You anticipated this position, though, and you go on to say, the fact that the laws of nature are necessarily true, the argument infers that the physical laws are necessarily true and are dependent on a necessary foundation. Reducing the laws to mere descriptions is not able to explain why the laws are consistent. The laws of nature that we have developed through our experiences are as immutable as reasonably can be with our current information. You see, these laws can be augmented, and in fact, they are expected to be augmented if new information arises which shows that the law is insufficient. That's a core tenet of science that you forgot to mention earlier: falsifiability. I ask you, what's falsifiable about your ad hoc assumption that God is needed for the underlying nature of reality to remain consistent? But back to my point, the goal of the laws of nature isn't to explain why they are consistent, because the very nature of these descriptions entails that they could be inconsistent. In fact, in your hypothesis, it is required that the laws of nature are inconsistent and are not immutable. The supernatural, by its very definition, requires the suspension of the consistent nature of reality, even on your very basic definition of God, because you describe him as a creator God. And if something can't come from nothing, as most apologists would say, then it definitely requires a suspension of the natural laws of reality in order for that creator God to create the universe. Can you give just one reason as to why the underlying nature of reality can't extend past the inflation of our universe? Can you give a reason why the inflation of the universe can't just be a natural consequence of the underlying fabric of reality? If not, then how do you rationalize God requiring a suspension of consistency while at the same time arguing that God is the only reason for the consistency? To me, this seems a bit contradictory, no? You go on to say, the necessary foundation would also possess the divine attributes associated with the creator God. For example, for the foundation to account for the change of the universe, it must be necessarily unchanging. Again, I keep coming back to you being able to distinguish between your God and just the natural fabric of reality. I feel like you've just presupposed that consistency requires some kind of causal agent. I don't see any reason why the fabric of reality or the underlying nature of reality can't itself just be consistent without the need of some creator God. In your opening statement, you failed to establish why this ad hoc explanation of God did it is even needed. You also say, I established using the contingency argument that God is what grounds physical laws of nature. By grounding the laws, I'm saying that God is what makes reality operate. You continuously fail to distinguish your God from just the natural fabric of reality. I think one way that you could distinguish this the two is by showing how this God violates the natural order of reality. But this would also invalidate a good portion of your argument here because it requires a suspension of consistency. And it seems like you're in an untenable position. You go on to clarify what you mean by grounding the laws of nature in God. I am not saying that there exists some law of gravity in a Platonist sense that has control over the speed at which an object accelerates toward another object. I am saying that there's truth to the statement the acceleration due to gravity on Earth is 9.8 meters per second squared. For that to be true, there must either be something that makes it true, or it could be true due to its own necessity. So are you saying here that because God exists, that's the only reason why the acceleration due to gravity is 9.8 meters per second squared? This is just another ad hoc assertion that God is needed for this to be true. The water cycle, for instance, doesn't need some external force in order to make it function. It just does. This is the same as with laws like gravity and physics in general. You see, you need to establish that a supernatural intervention is needed for these basic things to function. And you simply haven't done that in your opening statement. And then you go on to define what you mean by fine-tuning. By fine-tuning, I am referring to the values of the physical laws that govern reality. These laws are set in a way that would allow for the existence of conscious, intelligent agents. Scientists have uncovered evidence that if two physical laws that govern our universe had been set with slightly different values, reality as we know it would be impossible. This fine-tuning argument ends up begging the question, though. It implies a conclusion as to why the universe is even here. In this quote, you seem to imply that the purpose of this universe is to produce conscious, intelligent agents. I don't think that this universe revolves around me, let alone our little planet. If this isn't a problem, then why even bring it up? There's nothing to say that a different universe didn't exist prior to this one, and that different universe had different values. The fine-tuning argument requires that the purpose of any universe is to produce life, and we have no indication that that is in fact the case. Another example of this assumption is apparent when you say, it is not reasonable though to conclude that life could arise in any universe. For example, taking a universe where gravity is much weaker, in that universe no stars would form because all matter would be so spread out that it would never condense into something like a star, and if there were no stars, then there would be no heavy elements, and therefore could be no life. Again, this just presupposes that the purpose of any universe that could exist is to produce life. This seems like just another ad hoc supposition that you've tacked onto your argument in order to make your idea of God work. I'm sure that I've gone over my time for a rebuttal. I'm really sorry about that, but if you guys will, we are going to be doing a sort of Q&A portion at the end of this entire YouTube debate thing. So if you will, leave me a question or a comment down below that I can respond to, and we will definitely try to work that in. Hey, while you're down there leaving me a question, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.